I'm Connor Old and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we're going to be looking at the 1963 class of films, a year that has one of the most expensive movies of all time, a great Oscar history year, but then also a Best Picture winner that we've now covered, Ordinary People, but I wanted to cover another Best Picture winner that I think has maybe been forgotten and lost to time. I'm talking about none other than 1963's Tom Jones. So, if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I look at a film that's been nominated for Best Picture that I believe has been forgotten. A movie that has sort of been lost to time, that people don't recommend as much, things like that. I look at the Oscar history and the 5 other nominees because I believe it's so crucial to understand the Oscar history, to understand the relevance and why maybe an Oscar movie has not been as well remembered. I also give my thoughts on the movie from a 2019 viewpoint, and then I also talk about why this sort of has been forgotten, sort of try to answer that central question. So, starting off with the first nominee here, we have, like I said at the top of the show, one of the highest grossing movies, one of the most expensive movies of all time, and actually at the time one of the highest grossing movies of all time. A massive hit, but one that barely even got back its overall production costs. The most expensive movie at the time, by far, Cleopatra. Just for a little bit of reference, this is a 4-hour epic done by Fox, who just recently has been sold to Disney for $71 billion. Yet this film almost bankrupted them at the time. This is very much in the 60s, we've talked about before, where epics rule. Similarly, the year before this, we have something like Lawrence of Arabia, Ben-Hur in 1960, and these movies, so are big epics comparable at their time that take something like Lawrence of Arabia, I believe it was 2 years to shoot, long shoots as well, similar to this one, which is 2.5 years, but the budgets were significantly less. They were big at the time with Ben-Hur and Lawrence of Arabia coming out with a budget of $15 million. Cleopatra was $44 million, including marketing, and the budget actual of the film was about $33 million, I believe. So pretty much double that of these previous films, just because there's so much that was going on at the time. And just reading some history about it, it's so interesting to see a director like Joseph Mankiewicz, who's an acclaimed director in himself, this movie really break him because of how long it took and how much it got taken away from him and the production disaster. It was just a huge nightmare. The 2 stars of the film, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, had sort of an affair going on that led to them leaving their wives to get together and marry, and they had sort of a whole very much public affair in that sense with the tabloids and whatnot. Elizabeth Taylor very much had a lot of sickness during the set. The producer was not as well trusted and destroyed his career. I mean, even you can say Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, they had one good film after this with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but they really weren't able together, especially as a duo, to put out great films after this. It really broke a lot of people in a very interesting way. Despite that, it was still a really big, massive success, but in a lot of senses, they weren't really the people weren't coming out to see a great epic. They were there to see sort of a mess that's been sort of advertised in the tabloids. And the Fox executive, the Fox executives lost some of their jobs. I mean, it was a whole sort of huge deal that almost bankrupted the company. Yet still, you spend all that money, you might as well get an Oscar out of it. And that was a bit of a surprise because it actually didn't get any of the precursors. So it was a film that, despite not getting any of those precursors, just was such a big deal at the time that people felt that it deserved to get nominated. Another nominee here is How the West Was Won. This is an all-star cast with multiple legendary Western directors, including John Ford, segmented into a lot of sort of these vignettes or these segments, different individual stories. Of course, How the West Was Won. And it was unique at its time because it used a cinerama technique where there was 3 film strips almost side by side, and it was projected in a curved screen. Unfortunately, though, if you see some footage on YouTube, you'll still see these lines now because you can't. It must have been amazing to see sort of this sort of curved screen, but it was a gimmick at the time, and they weren't able to sort of transfer properly. So some scenes, especially close-ups, you see these lines that are very distracting because it's actual 3 film strips almost stitched together in a lot of ways to create that sort of bent nature that would work on the screen. So dated definitely for this time, but very much, I'm sure, inventive at that time. But of course, I didn't want to talk about that one because it has a director like legendary John Ford, has Gregory Peck, has Henry Fonda, has John Wayne, Debbie Reynolds. I mean, there's a massive, massive star. So even if you're a fan of any of those, I'm sure you might go back of those stars. You might go back and check out How the West Was Won. Another nominee here is America, America. This is from director Elia Kazan. Of course, did Streetcar Named Desire and A Face in the Crowd and On the Waterfront. So he's already won Best Picture twice and Best Director twice. So this was a situation where he probably wasn't going to win, but still they're very well respected director. It is notable, though, as we're sort of going back and seeing a lot of these, how the Oscars work, very much so, there was still sort of rarely, similar to today, rarely the 5 Best Picture nominees would get the 5 Best Director slots. A lot of times it would be 3 or 4, with that sort of 4th or 5th slot going to maybe more of an auteur or a foreign film director. And this was very much the same, but actually to a more extreme degree. You had directors here like Martin Ritten, Otto Preminger, getting in those nominees instead of guys like Joseph Mankiewicz for Cleopatra. So it was almost in a lot of ways, especially this year, these sort of secondary Best Pictures by giving it to more of these auteurs. So really, at the end of the day, it came to America, America for Elia Kazan and then Tom Jones. And because Tom Jones was winning so many of those precursors, it was far and away the favorite going into the Oscar night for Best Picture. And then the final nominee we have here is Lilies of the Field. I think this one is still be remembered because while maybe not as remembered as something like Cleopatra, for example, it still it has a historical moment to it. We talked about briefly on the Sidney Poitier, in regards to Sidney Poitier in the I guess Who's Coming to Dinner episode, where I mentioned that this is the film where Sidney Poitier won his Best Lead Actor Oscar. It was the second African American actor to ever win an Oscar, and the first in Best Lead Actor. A monumental achievement. I don't think it wasn't done until, at least for Best Lead Actor, Denzel Washington for Training Day. So a whole sort of gap, but this was definitely a monumental time in African American representation in terms of film, and a significant moment because, like I talked about in that episode, Sidney Poitier was such a landmark sort of figure for this movement at this time, especially with regards to film and prestige and Oscar winners. And this one will, at the very least, go down in history as the film that Sidney Poitier won his Oscar for, and a significant part in African American film history. And then it comes down to Tom Jones. Like I mentioned before, was the runaway favorite because of winning the precursors, National Board of Review, Golden Globes, DGA. And then when the Oscar nominations came out, Tom Jones had a total of 10 nominations, beating out something like HUD, which had not a Best Picture nominee, but I think 6 other nominations, and Martin Ritt, so I think a total of 7 for that movie, but still didn't get a Best Picture nominee. So overall, when it came to the 2 directors that got nominated that also had Best Picture nominees were Elia Kazan for America, America, and Tony Richardson for Tom Jones. So it just made sense that Tom Jones would be sort of the overall favorite, and it ended up winning Best Picture. But despite that, unfortunately, for some reason, which I'm trying to explain, has less cultural impact than some of these other Best Picture winners than, say, like A Godfather or Lawrence of Arabia or Silence of the Lambs, where these have sustained for generations. But transitioning to my thoughts, I was actually pleasantly surprised by this movie because of how modern it felt, especially within this period backdrop. But I think it's to understand the sort of history of the film at this time and why maybe it got that Oscar. You have to understand a little bit about the British New Wave within the sort of the late 50s into the 60s, where a lot of these British films were coming out by Tony Richardson, the director of Tom Jones, his production company Woodfall, where we have movies like The Sporting Life and The Entertainer and Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, also starring Albert Finney. So this film, in a lot of ways, was the ultimate accumulation of all of these great new films that are coming out of Britain that tackled very much socioeconomic divide, class divide, in a country that has such a rich history with class divide. These were films that were finally showing for the first time not Shakespeare, not these sort of Emmerich Pressburger, wild, dark, sort of more traditionalist British lifestyles, very much more country, working class kind of social realism. You have filmmakers like Ken Loach or Tony Richardson coming out of this movement, and very influential directors, someone like Ken Loach, even still today. Now, it's also noted to mention that we had all those films. We had The Sporting Life, we had Saturday Night, Sunday Morning in the 60s. So by the time 63 comes around, people know it, and this is sort of seen as the top of it, winning the Oscar, making a lot of money, and starring the sort of face of the British New Wave in a lot of ways, Albert Finney, an actor who wouldn't have been able to get roles in the earlier system because he's sort of has he can sort of have a bit of a Cockney accent, I guess you would say, and sort of more of a working class aura, I guess you would say, about him, and physicality and look. But then those films were very much about the social realism and were urban and sort of socioeconomic and realistic in a lot of ways. Where this film, of course, a period piece, and it's also in color, where the other films were mostly in black and white. And those films were sort of serious. This one is a full-out comedy, but they really hit it out of the park. I enjoyed it quite a bit. There's some great sort of modern cinematography and editing patterns that make it feel very modern to today. Just the way how fast it moves, how it's almost a documentary style, where the camera is never sort of stilted on sort of a tripod. It's always sort of handheld or moving. There's some sort of unique editing patterns with the sort of stag sequence where they're racing after a deer on horses. It's sort of a chaotic visual attack on your senses. There's an amazing sort of sexual desire eating scene where they're looking back at the camera and they just eat and gorge themselves for like 10 minutes. I think to a certain extent the film maybe will be a little bit too long, but I think that overall you have to sort of take a mindset of it going into it. I think you'll be able to enjoy it if you take the mindset of this is a film that is a slice of life film. In a lot of ways, it's just following Tom Jones in his adventures. I think the visuals are beautiful enough. I mean, there's some almost Terrence Malick, Days of Heaven type montage sequences that are really beautiful. There's some sort of evolution of the silent film with the score and the sped up running and sequences that are very much played for this sort of physical comedic aspect and humor that we rarely see today, which was sort of a breath of fresh air. And I think you'd be really surprised that this is a film unlike, I thought something like Nicholas and Alexandra and Anna of the Thousand Days, movies we've covered here on the series, were sort of that pace because it was the 60s and that's how these films were sort of done. But you look at something like Tom Jones, which feels so modern, which feels so innovative even today, that it makes you wonder, why don't those films just do what this is? Because it's so entertaining, because it's so funny, because it's just so visually interesting to look at as well, using things like on-set locations and sort of bringing in a lot of new talent and new faces that I haven't seen. Really, really interesting film. One small part where Hugh Griffith throws water on a dog, his drink on a dog. I didn't like that too much, that made me upset. But why has this been forgotten? Why has this film been forgotten? Well, I think for one reason, I think it's a terrible name, Tom Jones. People don't really recognize the book as much. It's not something like Jane Eyre or Jane Austen novel that's more sort of well recognized. And I think that, you could argue that maybe he's sort of just a sexual sort of deviant in a lot of ways, just Tom Jones, and he's not sort of politically correct, I guess, in a lot of ways, because he's treating relationships with such lackluster, sort of disregard. It's very a hedonistic type of movie, so people may be negative to that. Maybe you won't like this movie. Looking up on some of the Letterboxd reviews, more than any other film I've covered on the series had sort of these 1-star reviews. So maybe that's it. I just think it has a terrible name, and it really hasn't been forgotten. It was probably the most forgotten. I wanted to talk about a Best Picture a movie, so I want to talk about it on this episode. But heck, it even has a Criterion release. So if that's not a seal of approval, I give it mine for Forgotten Oscar Films from Connor Rold. But if you enjoyed the video, make sure to comment below. If you've seen Tom Jones, let me know your thoughts of it. And if you want me to cover any upcoming films, remember we started in 1988 and have been working backwards. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.